My name is Maya Calloway. I'm 28 years old, and the afternoon my family accused me of stealing from my own father while he was dying, I learned that in certain families, grief doesn't bring people together. It just gives the cruelest person in the room a reason to act fast. My father had been sick for 11 months. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3 when they caught it, stage 4 by February. He ran a small commercial flooring business out of Knoxville, Tennessee. Nothing glamorous. About a dozen employees, contracts with office buildings and hotel chains across the region. He had built it from nothing, the way people in his generation did, with early mornings and handshake deals and a stubbornness that outlasted everyone who doubted him. I loved that about him. I loved almost everything about him. I worked as a financial analyst for a logistics company in Nashville, which is how I ended up helping him with his books when he got too sick to manage them himself. It started as weekend visits, then it became phone calls, then remote access to his accounting software, then a standing arrangement where I reconciled his accounts every 2 weeks and flagged anything that needed his signature. My brother had no interest in the business. He sold residential real estate in Knoxville and had made it clear for years that he considered our father's company unglamorous and small. He showed up for holidays. He sent texts on birthdays. He was present the way furniture is present technically there, not actually useful. When my father passed on a Thursday morning in late March, I was the one sitting in the hospital chair beside him. My mother was in the hallway. My brother arrived 40 minutes after the end, slightly out of breath, smelling like he had driven fast from somewhere he didn't mention. 3 days later, at the reception after the funeral, my brother pulled my mother into the corner of my aunt's kitchen, and when they came back out, neither of them would look at me directly. I noticed but said nothing. Grief does strange things to people's faces. That evening, my mother called me into the back bedroom and asked me, in a voice so careful it frightened me, whether I had made any transfers out of my father's business account in the weeks before he died. I told her the truth. I had made 2. Both were regular vendor payments I had been authorized to process for months. Both had paper trails in the accounting system, and both had been discussed with my father over the phone the week before he lost the ability to hold a conversation. She nodded slowly. Then she said my brother had found something in the records that concerned him. I asked what specifically. She said she didn't want to get into it right then. She said it had been a long day. The next morning, my brother texted me directly, for the first time in 4 months. The message said, "I know what you did. So does Mom. We're handling the estate without you." I stared at that sentence until the words stopped making grammatical sense. Within 48 hours, my aunt had stopped returning my calls. My father's business partner, a man I had known since I was 12, sent me a 2-sentence email saying he had been advised not to communicate with me during the estate process. My cousin, who had sent me 3 voice messages the week of the funeral, went completely quiet. The silence happened the way silence always happens in families, not all at once, but in a fast, coordinated pattern that tells you someone made phone calls you weren't on. I drove back to Nashville in a fog. My best friend Danny met me at my apartment that night with a bottle of wine, 2 containers of soup she had not actually made herself, and the specific expression she reserves for situations where she is furious on your behalf, but trying not to say so before she has all the facts. Danny works in HR for a healthcare company. She is the kind of person who speaks in complete sentences during arguments, who writes things down before important conversations, and who once handed a former boyfriend a printed list of the reasons she was breaking up with him, organized chronologically. I have loved her unconditionally since we were 22. She sat across from me and listened to everything. When I finished, she set down her soup and said, quietly and without drama, "Your brother did not find something in the records. Your brother put something in the records. Or he's describing the records in a way that sounds like something, because ambiguity is easier to defend than an outright lie." I wanted to argue. I was tired enough that doubt was genuinely easier than anger. "Maybe there's a transaction I forgot about," I said. "Maybe I made an error." Danny looked at me the way she looks at benefit enrollment forms that have been incorrectly completed. "You are a financial analyst," she said. "You do not forget transactions. You have the receipts, the reconciliations, and the phone logs. So stop grieving and start thinking. What changed between the funeral and the moment your brother pulled your mother aside?" I didn't have an answer that night, but the question lodged itself somewhere behind my sternum and stayed there. The next morning, I pulled up the accounting software from my laptop. I still had read access, no one had revoked my credentials yet, which told me either my brother hadn't thought of it or he hadn't needed to. Everything I had touched was exactly as I'd left it. Both vendor payments were documented with attached invoices, approval notes, and timestamps. Nothing had been altered, nothing was missing, but there was a new entry, dated 2 weeks after my father's death. A transfer of $22,000 from the business operating account to a holding account I didn't recognize. No invoice attached, no description beyond the word transition. The authorization signature field showed my name. I read it 3 times. My name was in that field. My name, spelled correctly, in the authorization line of a transfer I had never made, for money I had never touched, to an account I could not locate in any of the records I had maintained. I took a screenshot. Then I took 6 more. Then I called Danny. She answered on the second ring and said, "Before I could speak, I already know it's bad, tell me." I told her. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "He used your existing access as the cover story. Because you had been in the system for months. No one would blink at your name showing up. He needed someone in those books who was already there." My chest went cold. But before I could think about what to do with that, the situation pulled us sideways. My cousin texted Danny. They had stayed loosely friendly through the years and said she had heard there was someone from my father's old business network who might know something about what my brother had been doing with the company finances before my father died. Not after. Before. For 2 days, Danny and I chased that thread hard. We tracked down the name, found a phone number, drove 40 minutes to a coffee shop in East Knoxville to meet a man who had done subcontract work for my father's company the previous year. He sat down, accepted the coffee we bought him, and spent 20 minutes telling us vague, wandering things about my brother's personality and business habits that amounted to nothing useful. The lead was cold, possibly a rumor, possibly exactly what it looked like, a grieving community of people swapping incomplete stories about a business that had just lost its owner. I drove back to Nashville with a headache and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been running towards something that wasn't there. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and laid out everything I actually had. The vendor payment records, my phone logs with my father, the screenshots of the unauthorized transfer, the timestamp discrepancy that showed the entry had been created after my credentials were technically inactive. I had stopped making updates the week my father was moved to hospice, 8 days before he died. I said out loud, to no one, "I have enough for a question, but not enough for an answer." And that was the part that kept me from going to anyone official. My brother had lived in Knoxville his whole adult life. He coached youth soccer. He was on a first-name basis with 2 city council members. My father had trusted him in a simple, unquestioning way that children of a certain era trusted their sons not because he had earned it specifically, but because he was the son. If I walked into the estate attorney's office with a screenshot and a discrepancy, my brother would cry. My mother would choose the version that kept the family together, and I would be, again, the daughter who caused a scene at the wrong time. Then the accounting software sent me an email I had not asked for. It arrived on a Tuesday morning at 7:43. The sender was the automated notification system for the business management platform my father had used for 12 years. The subject line read, "Audit Trail Summary, Account Access Report, Secondary Admin." I was in the middle of making coffee. I read it standing at the counter. The platform had flagged unusual login activity on the secondary administrator account, my account, and generated an automatic audit summary for all admin-level users as part of its security protocol. My brother, when he set up his own full admin access 3 weeks earlier, had not removed me from the secondary admin tier. He had added himself above me without deleting me below him, which meant that when the system ran its routine audit and sent the summary to all active administrators, it sent it to both of us. The attachment was 47 pages. I set down my coffee and opened every single one. The audit trail showed every login, every entry, every modification made to the business accounts over the previous 6 months. My activity was clean, dated, consistent, matching every payment I had documented separately. My brother's activity told a different story entirely. He had accessed the system 9 times in the 30 days before my father died. He had created 3 entries, then deleted 2 of them. He had modified the authorization field on the $22,000 transfer twice, once to enter a name I didn't recognize, and once to replace it with mine. The timestamp on that second modification was 11 days after my father's death, 4 days before my brother pulled my mother aside at the reception. He had not found something in the records. He had written something into the records. And then he had used my standing access everyone in the family knew I had, access that made perfect sense given my months of legitimate work as the frame. I texted Danny one sentence. I have the audit trail. She called me before I finished reading it back to myself. Read it to me, she said. I did. By the time I reached page 12, she had already gotten in her car. We sat at my kitchen table, with the audit summary printed and spread between us, and Danny said something that I have thought about every day since. She said, "This is why he needed it to be you, specifically. Not just someone. You. Because your name was already there. And people don't question a name that was already there." That night I had a choice. Send the audit trail directly to the estate attorney, or confront my brother first. I chose my brother, not because I thought he would confess easily, but because I wanted to see the moment his performance stopped working. I drove to Knoxville the following morning and called him from his driveway. He came out in the way people come out when they're not expecting a confrontation, open expression, casual posture, the confidence of someone who believes the story they've been telling has already settled. He started to say something about how this wasn't a good time. I said I would only need a few minutes. I asked him directly, "Did you modify the authorization field on the $22,000 transfer?" He laughed. That short, dismissive sound men make when they want to signal that a question doesn't deserve a serious answer. He said I needed to stop playing accountant with a dead man's records and let the estate process work the way it was designed to work. I held up my phone with the audit summary open on the screen. The laugh stopped. I watched his expression move through 3 phases in about 4 seconds. Confusion, then calculation, then something that looked almost like respect, which was the most unsettling of the 3. "How did you get that?" he asked. "You left me on the secondary admin tier," I said. "The system sent it to everyone." He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he looked back at me. Then he said the sentence that collapsed every last piece of goodwill I had been, quietly, unconsciously holding on to for years. He said, "We needed it to be someone who'd already been in there. You were the obvious choice." Not a denial. Not an explanation. Not even a real apology disguised as one. We. The obvious choice. I had not stolen $1 from my father. I had driven 4 hours every other weekend to sit with him. I had managed his accounts while he was too weak to hold a pen. I had been in that hospital room on the morning he stopped breathing because I was the one who had stayed. And my brother had used all of that, the access, the presence, the trust as the raw material for a lie that cost him nothing and cost me everything. I walked back to my car without saying another word. On the drive home, my brother called 4 times. Then my sister-in-law called twice. Then a number I didn't recognize called once, which I assumed was his real estate partner or an attorney. I didn't answer any of them. That evening, Danny came over, and we built the documentation the same way you build anything that has to survive scrutiny. Carefully, in order, with no unnecessary anger, and no gaps. I drafted a formal email to the estate attorney. I stated that I had been falsely accused of making an unauthorized transfer from my father's business account. I attached the complete audit trail showing the modification history of the disputed entry, including the 2 prior versions of the authorization field, and the timestamps, proving the final change occurred 11 days after my father's death. I included my complete transaction history showing every entry I had made during my authorized period, each with corresponding invoices and phone log dates. I copied my mother. I copied my aunt. I copied my father's longtime business partner. At the end, I wrote one sentence. I managed these accounts because my father trusted me to, and I will not carry the cost of someone else's decision to use that trust as a cover story. I sent it at 9:17 that night. By 9:42, my brother had sent me 6 text messages, asking me to please not take this further, that it was a family matter, that the estate was complicated, and he had been under enormous pressure, that I was making things worse. My sister-in-law sent one message that said, This doesn't have to destroy everything. My mother called and left a voicemail. Her voice was shaking. She said she didn't know what to believe. She said she needed time. She said, please call her back. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I thought about standing outside that reception in my funeral clothes while my aunt watched from the doorway with an expression that said she had already decided. I thought about my father's business partner's 2-sentence email. I thought about my cousin's silence. I thought about all the phone calls my brother had made in the 48 hours after the funeral, and how none of them had been to ask me for my side. I put my phone face down on the counter and did not call anyone back. The estate attorney responded the following morning. She was formal, careful, and efficient, the way attorneys are when they recognize that the situation has moved from complicated to serious. She confirmed receipt of the documentation and said she would be conducting a full review of the account modification history before proceeding with any estate distributions. My brother called her office 3 times that day, according to a brief note she sent me that evening. She had advised him to communicate through counsel. 2 days later, my father's business partner called me directly. He had seen the audit summary. He said he owed me an apology for the email he had sent, that he had taken my brother's account at face value because grief had made him inclined to believe the person who was louder. He said the words, "I should have called you first," and I believed him, because he said it like a man who meant it rather than a man who was managing a situation. He also told me something I hadn't known. My brother had approached him 2 weeks before my father died about purchasing the business at a significantly reduced valuation, framed as a family simplification, a way to spare everyone the complexity of a proper sale. The partner had declined. He hadn't mentioned it to my father because he hadn't wanted to add to his burdens. When I heard that, the full picture assembled itself in a way that made my stomach drop. My brother hadn't panicked after my father died and grabbed at the money. He had planned it while my father was still alive. The $22,000 wasn't the end goal, it was a test, a first move. A way to get money out before the estate locked, and a story already prepared to explain it if anyone looked. He had watched me manage those accounts for months, and decided the most efficient lie was the one that borrowed my name. I drove back to Knoxville one more time. Not to my brother's house. To my mother's. She opened the door looking like someone who had not slept in 3 days, which she probably hadn't. I came inside and sat at the kitchen table where I had done homework and eaten dinner and had every important conversation of my childhood. She sat across from me with her hands folded and her eyes wet before I even said anything. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I laid the audit trail on the table and walked her through it page by page, the same way I would walk a client through a financial review, calmly, sequentially, without interpretation until the facts were all on the table. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I should have asked you first, before I said anything to anyone." "That's true," I said. She reached across the table. I didn't take her hand, but I didn't move away either. She said, "Your brother told me he had seen proof. He said it was obvious." I said, "He told you what he needed you to believe before I had a chance to speak. That's not proof. That's a head start." She started to cry then. Not the performance kind, the real kind, the kind that comes from the specific shame of realizing you chose wrong. She said she had wanted to keep the family together. She said it had all happened so fast. She said my father would have been devastated. I said, "My father would have asked me directly. That's the difference." She had no answer for that. I didn't expect one. I went home and let the estate process move the way it was going to move. The attorney's review took 11 days. At the end of it, the unauthorized transfer was reversed. The modification history was flagged in the official estate record, and my brother was informed that any further distributions would be subject to additional scrutiny and independent accounting oversight. His attorney sent a letter describing my brother's actions as an administrative error made under grief-related stress, which I read once, set down, and filed in a folder I labeled documentation rather than evidence, because I had learned by then that the most powerful thing a record can be is simply a record. My father's business partner offered to buy the company at a fair valuation. My mother accepted. The employees kept their jobs. My father's name stayed on the trucks. My brother showed up at my apartment in Nashville about 3 weeks after everything settled. I did not let him inside. We stood on opposite sides of the doorframe, the same way you stand with a neighbor you don't actually know, adjacent but not close. He said he had been under impossible pressure. He said the business had been losing money before my father died, and he had panicked. He said he never actually believed I would be seriously accused. He said he thought it would blow over. I said, "You built a lie and put my name on it the week we buried our father." He said, "I know." I said, "That's not a mistake. That's a choice." He asked if we could work toward something eventually. Some kind of understanding. He said we were still family. I looked at him for a moment, at the brother who had taught me to ride a bike and made me watch terrible action movies and shown up 40 minutes late to our father's death, and then tried to build a financial crime on my reputation before our father's accounts were even frozen. I said, "You don't get to use that word right now." He left. I watched him walk back down the hallway, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction. Not anger. Just a very clean, very quiet kind of clarity. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for someone to be who you needed them to be and simply see who they chose to be instead. Danny came over that night. She brought a very expensive candle she said I deserved, a box of the specific crackers I always eat when I'm processing something, and the energy of a woman who had been waiting to celebrate properly for 3 weeks. We sat on my couch, and she said, "You know what got him?" "The audit trail," I said. She shook her head. "His own laziness. He could have taken you off that admin tier in under 2 minutes. He just didn't." She was right. And that was the thing nobody talks about when they talk about people who lie this way. It's not that they're careless. It's that they're so certain the performance will work that they stop maintaining the details underneath it. My brother had spent months building a story. He had not spent 2 minutes checking whether the system would send the audit summary to the person his story was about. My mother and I talk now, carefully, and not very often. She has never fully said I was wrong in those exact words, but she has said things that circle it closely enough that I have decided to accept the approach rather than hold out for the phrasing. My father's voice is still in my phone as a saved contact that I haven't deleted. I'm not ready for that yet, and I have decided not to rush. My brother and I have not spoken since the doorframe conversation. He sent a message on my father's birthday, "Thinking about you today," and I read it and put my phone in my bag and took a long walk through my neighborhood until the feeling of it faded enough to function. I went back to work. I kept my job. I started sleeping without a list of timestamps running through my head at 2 in the morning. Danny helped me rearrange my living room, which she said was a necessary act of reclaiming the space, and which I think was mostly just an excuse to move the bookshelf she had always disliked. A few weeks after it was all over, the estate attorney sent me a final note, professional, brief, the kind of correspondence that signals the end of a chapter. At the bottom, in a handwritten postscript, she had written, "Your documentation was impeccable. Your father would have been proud of how you handled this." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I folded the letter and put it in the folder where I keep things I want to remember when I'm not sure I'm okay. Because here's what I have come to understand about the whole thing, now that the noise has quieted and I have had enough distance to see it clearly. My brother didn't come up with that lie in a moment of panic. He constructed it slowly, the way people construct anything they plan to rely on. He watched me work in those accounts for months, learned my patterns, understood my access, and built a story that fit around everything I had legitimately done. That's not desperation. That's deliberate. And the difference matters, because it means there was never a version of events where this ended well without proof. He would have cried, and my mother would have chosen peace, and I would have spent years being quietly referred to as the reason the estate got complicated. The audit trail didn't give me power over him. It just gave everyone else something they couldn't cry over. People talk about family betrayal like the wound is in the betrayal itself. And it is, but only partly. The deeper wound, at least for me, was realizing how quickly everyone stopped asking whether it was true. How a 2-day head start on a lie was enough to rearrange an entire family's certainty. How the people who had known me for 28 years required a 47-page document to remember who I actually was. But here's what I keep coming back to. The thing that has stayed with me longer than the anger. The audit trail was always there. My documentation was always there. The truth was always there. The only thing that changed was that my brother left me on the admin list, and the system sent me what I needed to show it. He forgot one box. And that one box was enough. Not because proof destroyed him, but because proof made performance useless. And for people who have built their entire position in a family on the ability to perform, on being loud first, on being believed without question, on occupying the space before anyone else can speak, the one thing they cannot recover from is paperwork. I stayed in Nashville. I kept my apartment, my job, my Friday dinners with Danny. I kept my father's watch, which my mother brought over in a small box with a note that said, "Only he would have wanted you to have this." I keep it on my desk rather than my wrist because I like being able to see the face of it while I work. And when people ask me whether I regret not trying harder to hold the family together, I tell them the same thing every time. You cannot hold together what was already being used against you. The only thing you owe a family that throws you out without asking is the truth. Once you've given them that, the rest is theirs to carry. Mine looked like 47 pages, a cold cup of coffee, and a system notification that got sent to the wrong administrator. But it was enough. Because here is the thing about people who only reach for you once the proof has already arrived. The thing worth asking yourself if any part of this story sounds familiar. When someone who hurt you suddenly wants to reconcile, are they sorry for what they did? Or are they sorry that it didn't work? That question has one answer. The hard part is being willing to hear it.